America from the madness consuming Europe and Asia. Some in the group were pacifists, but most were not. Lindbergh was not. He contended that a security perimeter close to American shores, proclaimed at once and defended as necessary, was most likely to bring real and lasting security. He rose to speak. The audience inside the Manhattan Center fell silent and leaned forward to listen. As they did, the shouts from the throng outside became audible. The police had closed 34th Street to vehicles and pushed the crowd back from the doors of the building, but they hadn't been able to keep the protesters and counter-protesters from exchanging epithets and blows. To those inside, the violence in the street sounded a warning against the much greater violence they aimed to avert. Radio carried Lindbergh's address, and millions tuned in. Franklin Roosevelt did not. The president knew what the aviator was going to say. It was what the isolationists had been saying for 2 decades, since indeed they torpedoed the Treaty of Versailles in the Senate at the end of the World War. Their opposition to foreign commitments had intensified since then, and it kept the United States out of the League of Nations, signaling to the enemies of freedom that they could have their way with the countries they trampled and brutalized. Politics had prompted Roosevelt to hold his tongue during his first 8 years in office. He knew that by riling the isolationists, he would imperil the New Deal and spoil his chances of alleviating the domestic distress of the country. But the outbreak of war abroad had increased demand for the products of American farms and factories and revived the economy, and his election to a 3rd term gave him a mandate for stronger action internationally. The Lend-Lease program Congress had recently passed was heartening the British, the Chinese, and others fighting the Axis. American convoys would ensure that the American-made weapons and provisions reached their intended destinations. Roosevelt rejected much of what Lindbergh and the isolationists were saying. He had to admire their cleverness in claiming the label America First, which implied that their opponents had dubious priorities. Roosevelt considered himself as much an America Firster as Lindbergh and the others. He simply had a clearer view of where America's interests lay. Their policy was really America alone, at a time when the United States needed all the help it could get in dealing with the existential challenge of militant fascism. Those in the Lindbergh crowd who weren't outright apologists for Hitler underestimated the degree to which the Nazi regime required war to maintain its legitimacy. Hitler wouldn't stop until he came after the United States, and if he controlled all of Europe by that time, America would be truly and terrifyingly alone. Aid to Britain wasn't for the sake of Britain. It was for America's sake, to keep Britain's fleet afloat and Britain itself viable as a launch pad for fighting Hitler on the eastern side of the Atlantic rather than the western. Yet Roosevelt silently acknowledged an essential part of the isolationists' argument, that American aid to countries fighting the Axis made America's direct intervention more likely. In public, Roosevelt said the opposite, that America sent guns to the wars in Europe and Asia so it wouldn't have to send soldiers. He hoped this might be so, but he didn't believe it. Hitler and the warlords of Japan wouldn't stop till they met an immovable object, and American military power was the only such object left to oppose them. By the time Lindbergh addressed the America First meeting, Roosevelt had concluded that sooner or later America would have to take on Germany and Japan, and sooner would be better than later. Yet the isolationists might still frustrate his design. They were more dangerous than ever now that Lindbergh was their charismatic spokesman, which was all the more reason for Roosevelt to keep his conclusions to himself. Part 1. The Allure of Neutrality. Chapter 1. A more terrible thing couldn't have happened to a more admirable man. Such was the reaction of Americans as they read that the infant son of Charles Lindbergh had been kidnapped.